So today, everyone, we have on Neil Waters. Neil was dubbed the Australian Tiger King, and he is the president of the Thylacine Awareness Group of Australia. He's dedicated a great deal of his life into researching and exploring the Tasmanian tiger, also known as thylacine, who many believe was wrongly deemed extinct. Neil, we appreciate you coming on today. How are things, my man?
Yeah, things are good, mate. Doing all right. It's starting to warm up here finally, so hopefully no more frost and my pumpkins and tomatoes don't get burnt anymore.
Oh, there you go. Exactly. Neil, tell us kind of how you got into thylacine research and how did it all start?
Well, I guess I remember seeing the animal in primary school back in the 70s growing up, and it said presumed extinct. And that kind of fascinated me because I didn't really know what presumed extinct actually meant. I asked the teacher and he explained it to me, what it meant. And I thought, oh, wow, so what if it isn't, sort of thing, you know? Anyway, moved forward about 35 years, maybe 40 years. And when I first moved down here in 2010, I was walking my dog over by the lake, only a couple of kilometres from my house here. And she took off chasing a wallaby. And I was yelling out. She wouldn't come back because she was obviously on the hunt, having a bit of fun. She had no hope of catching it. She was way too fat, but she was having fun anyway. But something started following me, and it was sort of stalking me, and I could hear it walking and crunching branches quite noisily. And every time I stopped, it stopped. So that was sort of made the hair on the back of my neck stand up a bit. I got a bit further up the track, about another 10 minutes or so, and I stopped, and it came out, and it sat behind a clump of grass looking at me. It was sitting up like a dog. I could see the tops of its ears, and I was trying to get closer to it to get a better look, and I was tiptoeing towards it. It was probably about, I'm going to say probably 15, 20 metres away, and I got too close. It took off. When it took off, I saw the side of the animal. It was about half an hour or so before dark. It was in October 2010. I couldn't say I saw stripes, but it was a rusty brown colour, and I could see the long straight tail, and it just took off through the brush sort of thing. And I was perplexed because I knew of tigers, and I thought, I wonder if that was one. And then I was chatting to the mechanic in the local town about it. And he ended up suggesting I should speak to a friend of his who does research in this, and that's Andrew, who's in the Vice documentary that you would have seen. And I rang Andrew up, went and met him. He showed me some photographs of his, which were quite intriguing. He showed me some plaster casts of prints, told me what to look for. And I was a little bit fascinated, and I sort of went back and forth to that spot a few times, saw nothing, kind of forgot all about it. Well, then in 2014, I decided to turn my house into a holiday rental and set it up as Tassie Tiger Lodge, just short-term holiday sort of thing. So I was down here doing some work on it, and I was looking out the window one moonlit night, letting in a bit of fresh air because it was quite warm, even though I had the fire on. It was getting a bit too warm inside. So I got French windows on the bedroom, and I opened the French windows up, just staring at the moonlight. And I saw another one walk past on the track outside my property. There's a track that goes into an old tin mine out the back. And this one I saw in the moonlight. It wasn't very big. It was quite small, but it was long and sleek. And I could just see it was a grey sort of colour in the moonlight. You couldn't really define a lot. Again, I couldn't say I saw stripes, but it moved really quickly and swiftly, had that peculiar gait about it, and went across the road and disappeared in the bush. To coincide with that, I went over to the lake walking the dog, I think the next day or the day after, and there in this creek was all of these footprints where one had been chasing this wallaby. So then I was really interested because I remember what Andrew told me to look for regarding the prints, and they seemed to fit in perfectly with his description. So I did a short video of those prints. Sadly, I didn't take plaster cast, but it doesn't matter. I've taken many since. I started investigating. Oddly enough, I went back to Adelaide in South Australia because I was living back there at the time. I'd relocated. And I got quite ill with pulmonary embolism, which is blood clots in your lungs. And I was quite sick, and I was bedridden for about 3 weeks. So while I was sitting up in bed, I got on the laptop and started searching about all this stuff. Ended up on Facebook, found some groups on there, and didn't get a very warm reception because all the people in these groups were experts and skeptics. And I put my prints out there to say, well, I found these and I'm pretty certain this is what they are. And I got scoffed at and barked at and howled down and had a lot of online wars with a few people, as you do.
Fair enough.
And then a lady approached me on the quiet and said, don't listen to those dickheads. You've got thylacine prints there. And she sent me some photos of hers from Victoria on the mainland in Victoria, and they matched up perfectly. So she sort of got me involved and kept feeding me information. Sadly, that relationship, that friendship ended up parting a couple of years later. But about I think it was November 2014, I got sick of all the other people in their groups, and I decided to start my own group. So that's how it was originally the Thylacine Awareness Group of South Australia.
Okay.
Because I got a file of sightings from the museum. They said, yeah, you can copy all this and take the info away. And I started going through it all, and I had no idea that it was such a mainland phenomenon so widely, and especially South Australia in my home state. So I was really sort of intrigued by that and highly motivated, I guess, and the obsession began.
Well, definitely.
So, yeah, I started up the group in November 2014, and when we released our first video in 2016, which was the creature walking behind the garbage bin, you may have seen that. I saw
that one, yep.
Well, that was our first video release, and just before we would release that video, John and I decided that we'd make it the Thylacine Awareness Group of Australia, so it was more international and more inclusive, I guess.
Gotcha. So take me back here, Neil, to when you had those sightings. I mean, that's got to be remarkable for you, and especially now that you kind of have more knowledge of the animal. What would you say you would look for if you see its thylacine, other than the stripes on its back? What other kind of characteristics are prominent with that animal?
Well, the thing that gets described to me the most by witnesses who are, 99% of the time just random people who aren't looking for thylacines, they just see this thing, is the long, stiff tail. It's very kangaroo-like rear end on the animal. It looks very kangaroo-like in its rear structure. It's not a macropod, which is a hopping marsupial. Mm-hmm. It's a quadruped, but it can hop like a macropod, though. It can get up on its hind legs and hop. Wow. The stripes aren't always very obvious. The males tend to have a very buffy head, and both male and female have a very thick neck as well, going from the base of the head right down into the shoulders. Whereas a lot of other native animals, especially quolls and devils and things, don't tend to have that. They have a shorter neck. I mean, a devil has a thick neck, but it's very short.
And that's its closest relative, Neil. The Tasmanian devil would be like its closest. No.
What? No, mate. No, the closest living relative is a numbat, which is a small insectivorous marsupial, carnivore, but they eat primarily termites. Now, the interesting thing about numbats is they only now occur in Western Australia on the mainland. They used to be right across the mainland, but predation by foxes and cats and, colonialists shooting them, I suppose, as well, has reduced their numbers only to a couple of thousand in a small area of Western Australia. They've been re-released in a lot of fenced-off areas and sanctuaries, and they're doing quite well. They're bouncing back all right. But, yeah, numbats are the closest living relative, and they're not even in Tasmania to begin with.
Gotcha. So with the Tasmanian tiger, I mean, just like you said, with colonists hunting the numbats. Numbat is how you say it, Neil? Nombat?
Yeah, numbat.
Numbat. Okay.
N-U-M.
Oh, M. Okay, I gotcha. So Tasmanian tiger, was it hunted because it was, stalking livestock? What kind of happened to trigger its extinction?
It was a twofold thing. There was a colony that was a fledgling colony here in Tasmania. Sheep was going to be the order of the day for the colony, and that's how they were going to make their money. And so graziers took up land holdings. Because it looked like a wolf, they presumed it would be like a wolf and it would eat their sheep. And no doubt some sheep were taken by them, but they by far prefer their natural food, which is wombats, wallabies, paddy melons, and those sorts of things. So they'll target their natural food well before they will go and hunt sheep.
Gotcha. So what kind of size are you looking at here? Is it the size of a dog, a small dog, medium-sized dog? What would you say?
Well, if you talk to Nick Mooney, he'll tell you they're quite small and they don't get very big. But I don't really talk to Nick Mooney too much, only when I have to.
Gotcha.
No disrespect intended, but we have very different opinions. But when you talk to witnesses and they talk about what they saw, they'll describe it as an average-sized dog, like a Kelpie or a cattle dog. I'm not sure if you're familiar with those breeds, but they're not real big. But then you'll get someone say this thing was massive. It was as big as a German Shepherd. It was really big. So like a lot of animals, the males are bigger than the females. And from what I've found with the prints that I find, the females tend to peak at about 3.5 inches wide with their spores, their feet. And the males are about 4 to 4.5 inches wide with their feet.
Gotcha.
We found some prints last year which had two offspring in tow. So there was 3 sets of prints, and the offspring were about 2.25 inches wide, and the female was bang on 3.5 inches wide. So I'm positive that was a mother with 2 young in tow.
Gotcha.
And when I showed my plastic cast to Nick Mooney in February in the Hobart Museum, he just said, "Oh, well, they're just too big to be thylacine," and he's been running around with his theory on what a thylacine print looks like for a very long time. And he's kind of been the last word on thylacines because he worked for the government and he was investigating sightings. He's never done a scientific paper on his theory. So therefore it's just a theory and it's not a considered fact or peer review. And I'm more than happy to challenge him on it because we find prints that match up with the big 5 toes all over Australia. Every state of mainland Australia, we've got these prints from, and I get them in Tasmania as well, and they're identical. And if you have a look at Pocock's paper from 1926, who did do a very good paper describing thylacine feet and devils and quolls, and you have a look at that drawing and then you have a look at my print cast, they match up to a T. And I've already had a international dog show judge with over 60 years experience have a look at my print cast and go on the record and say unequivocally they are not any kind of dog that he has ever judged. And he's judged every breed of dog there is. So I'm inclined to consider his 60 years experience a little bit more on the money than Nick Mooney's untested theory.
Oh, exactly. So tell us a little bit more about this Nick Mooney guy, just so everyone knows here. What was your relationship like with him when all this started and kind of how did it evolve to where it is now?
Well, what happened was back in February, I was doing the 3 monthly check of the trail cams. I bring all the cards in. I go through them all. I found 5 photos, actually. There was 5 photos. There was 2 night photos, which was the face of the young one. The first one was blurry. The second one was very clear. Then there was a photo of what I believe to be the mother, then the juvenile, and then the father. They were all in a row. They were numbered. Sadly, the camera had actually reset the factory settings because technology likes to mess with you sometimes.
It does.
So I didn't have the correct date or time, but the timestamp was wrong, but the sequence of photos was bang on, the numbers. So I knew what I was looking at. I was quite adamant what I was looking at. I was looking at quadrupeds, not macropods that hop. So I went to the committee. I showed the photos. We talked about it for about a week. I showed them the different points. We compared them. We researched it. We went back and talked about it, and they started to see what I could see. And I said, well, I'm going to do the right thing, and I will give the museum an opportunity to have a look at these because I've finally got something that I'm convinced is bang on the money, and it's proof of breeding. Now, that's the most important thing here to get it reclassified. We must prove that it breeds to the IUCN, which is the International Union of Conservation Networks.
Mm-hmm.
They're the ones that classify things as extinct, endangered, rare, whatever. So proof of breeding is critical. So I thought, well, I've got proof of breeding here because there's this tiny little Joey in between the mum and the dad. I'll go to the museum. I contacted the museum. The lady at the museum, Dr. Catherine Byrne, was very standoffish and not very cordial at all. In fact, she tried to ignore me for a while and then denied certain things that they have in the collection. And I corrected her on her denials and said, well, here's the proof that you do have such things in your collection. And I would like to see them because it's a public institution and they're public property.
Mm-hmm.
So I'll bring down my photos, you get those print casts out, and we'll do a big comparison. Well, she's a moth expert. She's not a mammal expert. So she felt more compelled to bring Nick Mooney in because he's an honorary to the museum. So that's how Nick got involved. I'd heard a lot about Nick over the years. I'd never met the man before. And when I went down there, he was very polite, very cordial, very skeptical. And, we had an interesting conversation in regards to my plaster cast, and he had a look at the photos and he was, looking at them, and he sort of said to me, well, what would you like to see if this all comes to fruition, And I said, well, it'd be really good to see 1080 poison banned and maybe stop logging old growth forest. That would be probably pretty good. And he said, oh, yeah. And he sort of said to me, he leant back and he went, Neil, over the years, people have accused me of sort of protecting forestries because, I was employed by national parks for 30 odd years to investigate sightings and yada, yada, yada. And he sort of said to me, well, I say to that, well, if forestries has done such a bad thing, why do the people keep seeing the Tasmanian tiger? If it's still out there, then, clearly forestries hasn't done that much damage. And I thought about that and I thought, that's an interesting comment. But anyway, I emailed the photograph to Dr. Byrne, and with Nick was true to his word. Within about a week, he gave us his report on what he thought the photos were. Interestingly, he had 5 photos to look at, but he only chose to report on 2 because those 2 were the ones that he could ambiguously argue away and say are paddy melons. Gotcha. But the one of the face at night is clearly not a paddy melon, clearly not a devil, clearly not a cat, and we're starting to really run out of what it could possibly be. So he stayed away from that photo because he couldn't sort of fob that one off quite as easily, I believe.
Gotcha.
So his report was very limited. He then mentioned in his report that my plaster casts were of dogs and XYZ. This is the reason why. But when you have a look at the plaster cast, it's got a thumb. It's not a dew claw. It's got a thumb that comes right out like an opposable digit. It's clearly not a dog of any kind. And I will argue that till I'm blue in the face. So it's not a cat. It's not a dog. What are we left with in Australia? We've only got marsupials to choose from,
So why do you think there's such stigma about it? Why do you think, because it looks to me like you're just out there trying to do something good. And it's not like this is an animal that's never existed. It's not a Bigfoot. It's not something like that. This is something that, has gone extinct not that long ago. So why are people so reluctant to believe that there is populations of thylacine that still exist out there?
Well, look, ask a farmer or a witness and they'll tell you they're there. Ask a scientist and they'll say, bring me the evidence. These days, scientists have gotten a bit lazy and they want DNA for everything. But before DNA was a thing, they used to use a thing called calipers, and they'd go out and they'd measure something and they'd compare it and they'd write down notes. So, to those scientists that, demand DNA, I say get off your ass and go out and measure some things, and you might actually be able to learn something and prove something without requiring DNA. Suddenly DNA is the be-all and end-all of everything. I actually did produce some DNA evidence back in 2017. I found a very fresh scat, and it's massive. Well, it was massive. I haven't got it anymore, but I got it tested. I stored it in the freezer for a long time, and my girlfriend at the time got sick of this giant turd being in her freezer with her sausages and fish fillets.
Yeah,
so,
they will get sick of that.
Finally, So finally, I found somewhere where I could get it tested. I got it tested, and it came back as being 93% wombat, but it clearly wasn't a herbivore scat. It was a carnivore scat. So whatever the carnivore was, its last meal was wombat. Okay. Now, there was 1% numbat DNA in that scat. Now, this scat was, 6 inches long and like a Bondi cigar, it was, nearly 2 inches round.
Yeah.
So if a numbat had pushed that thing out, it would have turned the poor little bugger inside out because they're little, like a squirrel, they're a small animal. So because it had that poofdink of numbat DNA in there, in my opinion, that proves beyond any shadow of a doubt that was a thylacine, because it was found in Tasmania, it was found on a mountain in the middle of nowhere. And it had all the hallmarks of being a thylacine scat, but it didn't have enough DNA to get it over the line and say this is a thylacine scat, because they have identical DNA up until about 94%, and then one alters and branches off and becomes a thylacine.
Gotcha.
And like I said, numbats aren't in Tasmania, so we're running out of options for what that was,
Yeah.
So, getting back to science, they demand DNA and they demand something to cut up so they can look at it and say, yes, I've got some physical evidence here. And I kind of get that. But when you have an overwhelming amount of witness statements and anecdotal evidence to suggest that the animal really is there, you've got to start looking at science as not being the only way of proving something, because let's face it, there's a lot of Lazarus species that have come back in the last 10 years or so that were written off as extinct. So clearly their extinction model is classically flawed, and they need to relook at how they class something as being extinct. I mean, how much effort goes into that?
Yeah, definitely. So how are you looking right now, Neil? Do you have a number of camera traps? And also when it comes to DNA, what I was going to ask is, I know some people do like the sticky tape where they try to get hairs off the animal. I mean, is anything like that possible to try to get that DNA? I know it's easier said than done, but what kind of methods are you using to get evidence at the moment?
At the moment, I'm sound when I'm out in the bush. So I've got several sound recordings of what I believe are thylacines yipping. When they're hunting, they do a high-pitched yip.
Okay.
And it almost sounds like a little terrier. You wouldn't think such a beast of an animal would make such a squeaky
Can you do
noise,
it? Can you give us an example of what it sounds like?
It's sort of a yip.
Okay.
Yip,
Interesting.
like that.
Yeah.
So on our website, if you go to evidence thus far on Thylacine Awareness Group of Australia.com.au and scroll right down, there are some audio recordings on there.
Okay.
And I recorded them on a Zoom mic when I was out bush. Now, I've heard that at 5 different locations. One of those locations was my driveway in September last year, one night. So
Jeez.
they are in this area. I've seen them twice. I've found their turds. I've found their footprints. The only thing I haven't found in my area is a kangaroo with its head torn off, because that's the other bit of evidence we find quite a bit.
Gotcha.
So that when they feed, they feed on the blood-filled organs. They like the lungs and the heart. So they'll rip the head off and they'll remove the lungs straight out through the neck cavity and go away and eat it.
Did you ever hear? Well, that's funny because that reminds me of something I heard about chupacabra, I guess they call it, in Mexico, or and they said there was a couple thylacine that had escaped that could possibly be them because they like what you said, the blood-filled organs. What do you think of that? Do you think that's possible, or?
Look, with what's been going on the last couple of years in the world, anything's friggin' possible. Let's face it.
Yeah, fair enough. Fair enough.
I don't like to say no or rule anything out, because the minute you start getting rigid in your process, you start looking like all the other idiots out there, don't you?
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. Neil, how did Vice get a hold of you, and what did you think of the documentary that they put together? Did they capture it right? Did you have any positive thoughts, negative thoughts on it?
Vice first, it wasn't Vice, it was Walking Fish Productions initially, and they're the crew that got the funding through Vice.
Gotcha.
So David and a couple of the other members of the team first contacted me back in January 2017, and I met with them in Melbourne. I was at the AFRA headquarters, which is the Australian Rare Fauna Research Association, and I was there helping them digitise their files. They've got thousands of sightings, and I was there helping them, and I was just scanning files. I stayed at the lady's house for a couple of days just to help them sort out and digitise all their records. So I arranged to meet David and the rest of the crew there, and they interviewed me there and filmed me and did all this stuff. They applied for funding that year and they missed out. And then he stayed in touch with me, and then I caught up with him at the AFRA Christmas party that year, or maybe 2018, I think it was, in Melbourne. And I went over there. This is in Victoria. Went over there and caught up with him there as well, and he met a few other people. And then in February or January 2020, I think it was January 2020, they came over with a crew. And another person had joined the team, and that was Naomi. She ended up being the director. And they were going to pitch again for the funding, and they came over for a whirlwind 48 hours and had me in front of the camera for 18 hours one day. I was exhausted from 6 till midnight. I was just running around being filmed. But anyway, they filmed a whole heap of stuff for the pitch and went back, and they successfully got the funding. But then COVID hit, and they were landlocked in Victoria for several months before they could get over here. It took them a year basically to get back here and do the filming.
Wow.
In regards to what they produced, I was very happy with what they produced. They really wanted to go with the human story in relationship to the animal. So it wasn't necessarily all about the animal as much as it was about me and why I was chasing this animal. They were really interested in that relationship between people and nature. And I thought that was a really good approach. And I was happy to go with them. I read them the Riot Act in regards to having access to my personal life for as long as they were here. And certain things were out of bounds and certain things were okay. And they were very respectful, and they kept their word. They didn't try and belittle me or make me look like an idiot. I'm quite capable of doing that without anyone else's assistance. They did the right thing. Look, I would have included all 5 photos. I would have had, they did interview Nick Mooney, but they had to crunch down their footage so much they didn't even get to use the footage of Nick Mooney that they had. So there's quite possibly and highly likely going to be a part 2 to that. Whether they get funding for it or whether they just produce it themselves, I don't know. But they would have hours and hours of quotes and footage of me in the can that they haven't used. Like they would literally have enough to produce a whole hour without any trouble at all, and not even need to interview me again, really. Yeah. So I was really happy with what they produced. It was respectful. It was a little bit safe. I'm a bit of a outspoken, controversial kind of person. I'm a strong believer in busting eggs to make an omelette, mate. You know?
Yeah, that's good. Good, fair enough.
So I was very happy with their end result. I thought they did a really respectful, really good job. It was very good.
Awesome. If you're going looking for thylacine, or if you're looking for an encounter, I mean, you're not going to walk downtown Sydney, Australia, right? Like where would you be looking? Remote areas of Tasmania, even remote areas in northern Australia. What areas do you feel are most likely to hold those populations of thylacine?
Well, it's interesting that you say remote, because there's sightings in almost inner suburban Melbourne in Victoria. I've got lots of sightings from the fringe of Adelaide as well in South Australia, like right on the edge of the urban fringe. And the same goes with Sydney as well, because Sydney, now in New South Wales, that's moving out into the bush a lot more as it gets bigger and bigger. And, these animals are on the fringe of that habitat, and they sneak in. And they'll steal your cat and your dog and kill them and eat them if they get a chance. If they're hungry enough, they'll steal your chickens. They'll steal your ducks. So I don't necessarily believe we have to go to the edge of the known world. We get a lot of these people join the group and say, I'm going to go to the southwest wilderness in Tasmania. I'm going to hike in and I'm going to prove that the thylacine is there, because that's where it's going to be. But I get sightings from everywhere. So wherever I'm getting my sightings from is generally where I go and investigate and look at the lay of the land and and what features it has that may be suitable corridors and things like that, really. It's all based on sightings data primarily. Sometimes you'll be driving along and you'll see an area and it just really stands out for some reason. You think, man, I bet you they hunt there at some stage. But these are very solitary animals and they move around quite a bit. And they only really come together as a couple when they've got young in the pouch and at foot. So, you know, they're very hard to find, as you can tell.
Yeah, no, that's what I was going to ask too. So with all the camera traps and stuff, I mean, is the reason that getting, you know, that compelling footage so hard because they are skittish and, you know, they kind of shy away from interactions, especially around humans, or what's like the biggest obstacle in getting that footage?
I guess the fact that they're so solitary and move around quite a bit is the biggest obstacle per se. Knowing an area where they cross the road frequently, where they're seen, you know, every year or every 2 years, they're seen crossing the road in a particular place is really useful information. That gives you an idea of the corridor. So you may, you know, try and put half a dozen cameras at any one of those game trails that are crossing that road in that, say, 100, 200 metre section, and you're just playing pot luck, really. I mean, Andrew's been at this for a very long time, and Andrew's managed to have a couple of spots where he knows they go through, and so he can target them quite well. I've now got probably 3 spots where I'm quite certain they go through at certain times, but it's anyone's guess as to how often or you know, how ill frequently they do go through. But you do see a bit of a pattern with a lot of the sightings data, and that's why it becomes so important.
Why do you think people are so fascinated with the animal? I mean, you know, your group, I joined it to get a hold of you and to kind of see what was going on in the Thylacine Awareness Group. Why do you think people are so fascinated with the animal?
Probably a couple of things. I mean, where do I start with that one? Look, people appreciate a no-nonsense approach to life. There's so much bullshit in life. History's a lie for the better part, and we're learning more and more about that stuff every day. This animal was persecuted by men primarily, and it was because it was a deliberate persecution that this animal was pushed to the brink of extinction. So there's a certain amount of guilt that comes with that as a society, not necessarily just the Australian society, but everybody feels that pain, you know, think, oh man, why were people so fucking stupid, you know? But people are inherently stupid. We learn as we go. We get older, we get wiser. It seems to be the way it rolls. So, but I really, truly believe that this animal, because it's not a cryptid, it really did exist or does exist, it represents hope. You know, we see the natural world falling to the wayside constantly with development of industry, farming, mining, forestries. We need all these resources to have the standard of living that we have, but there's a cost for all of that. And the cost usually is the natural environment suffers. And, you know, you know yourself, you go camping and suddenly you feel alive. You're out of that urban sprawl. You're out of the concrete jungle. You're in nature. And I think that's where humankind belongs. We belong in nature. But society has dragged us away from that and that connection. And the closer we can get to that connection, the more wholesome we feel. I know I certainly do.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I mean, we called that little baby Hope because that's what it represents. It's
Definitely.
hope. So, you know, this animal is just a fascinating animal. It's a weird animal. It looks like a dog. It runs like a horse. It acts like a cat. And it's a freaking marsupial with a backward pouch, you know, and it can hop like a kangaroo or run on 4 legs. It's a weird
Crazy. It's crazy. Neil, so when this kind of, it just sparked, you know, with guilt and what you mentioned there was a lot of wildfires that had happened in Australia, I guess over last year, and they're pretty devastating. Did sightings increase during this time? What kind of went on there?
Well, during the fires last year in New South Wales, we had a sightings report from a firefighter who saw one fleeing the fire front. He went into a pub and was having a beer after being out fighting fires all day and just let it slip to someone. They got in touch with me and told me about it. I have had instances where we've had fires in South Australia. We had some pretty bad fires in January 2015. And then later on in 2015, 16, I had sightings in those burnt areas. Wow. So it doesn't necessarily mean they get caught in it. That most things get the hell out of the way of the fire if they can. They know it's coming well before we do. They've got much better sense of smell. Ideally, I suppose, sadly, it would be kind of good to find one that was caught in the fire and burnt and dead and lying there on the ground. Then we'd have our physical evidence, as macabre as that may sound. The one thing about the Australian bush is it's adapted to fire for many, many thousands of years with the Indigenous people. The First Nations people sort of use fire stick farming, as they call it, and they manage the bush quite well. And before whitefellas got here, the bush wasn't as thick as what it is now in many areas, because the blackfellas used to burn it and use it, and they would crop it literally. They would collect seed from the grains, the different native grasses, and they would use those cleared grassy areas as hunting grounds because it created feed for herbivores, which they could throw a spear at and take home for dinner. So, the bush has changed quite a bit. But, eucalyptus trees in particular are fireproof. There's only one breed or one species of eucalyptus trees that's not fireproof. So as soon as they get burnt, they go dormant for quite some time, 2 or 3 months. As soon as the first rains come and it cools down, these epicormic buds shoot out from under the bark and they're lush, covered in life again. And a lot of the plants have adapted to fire and they need fire to actually germinate. So even though we have had some devastating fires and there's a lot of property loss and a lot of animal life lost and stock and all that, it actually rejuvenates the bush. And it should be burnt on average about every 5 years. Then we wouldn't have wildfires. But try telling that to the government who think they know best.
Yeah. Good luck. Neil, answer this. So say, and it kind of brings us back to, guilt, human guilt and stuff. Let's just say, thylacine is completely extinct. With modern DNA cloning, and being able to bring stuff back, do you think if that was possible, do you think you should bring the Tassie tiger back? Is that something that we should look at if they were able to do that?
Personally, I'm a naturalist. I believe in God, whatever that is. I believe in creation. I'm not against science. I'm sure that science has got some fantastic things that it's brought to the realm. But I don't think we should. I don't think we can, mate. They've had the genome sequenced for several years now. Where's our thylacine? Come on. And we've got a scientist in Melbourne. I'm not going to give his name away because I'm not going to give him any airtime because he's a bit of a twit. But anyway, he's going to get $8 million to try and clone it, and I can't get 10 cents to try and prove it's there.
Wow.
So you tell me that's not a corruption of the system. Like, seriously,
Yeah.
He's the one that once was running around saying, well, these blurry photos aren't really good. We really need DNA evidence. He needs DNA evidence. I don't. I just need some solid proof that the thing's there so I can shove it up his ass and tell him to put his cloning kit away, get his calipers out, start measuring, get your ass out in the bush and do some research.
That's a good way to put it. So what happens now? What happens to you, say, tomorrow you find out it's not extinct. You find proof of the thylacine, out like 100% proof. Do you then try to become, from the Thylacine Awareness Group to the Thylacine Conservation Group? What would your steps be then?
Well, oddly enough, the government gets to determine in this country who can and can't have a charity. And for whatever reasons, they decide whether or not you can be a charity. Now, when we set up to go at Tas Inc., we did decide that it would be good if we could be a charity because then people could claim their donations on their tax and it might help us get a bit more resource to put into equipment and time out in the bush. So we went down the path of becoming a charity and they put more obstacles in front of us than Demolition Derby. So clearly they don't want us to be a charity because they say it's extinct. So that's their reasoning. So we just became an incorporated association. And as you know, with incorporated associations, to be a fluid, legitimate association, you have to have paid membership. So I come up with the idea of having paid membership and trail camera sponsorship to raise money to help support me do what I do, because I don't have a bucket of gold here. I'm sitting on the dwindling resource of my payout from my last government job 2 years ago, which is rapidly running out, I might add. But I don't go begging for money. Well, I just decided, well, look, we'll set up this trail camera sponsorship program. I found a place where I could import the cameras at a reasonable cost directly from China, because they make the most of them, and they're quite expensive to buy. To buy a cheap one is about $150 in Australia. But I got them for a reasonable price where we could make a little bit of money by having them sponsored. We only charge $120 a year to sponsor one, so we don't make a lot of money out of it. It pays for batteries, it pays for SD cards, and it helps pay for my fuel, because that's my most expensive resource, driving around to all these different locations, setting these things up. So, we ended up with all up just under 8, but a couple of sponsors have fallen off to the wayside as well. So that's given me a bit of leeway with spare cameras. So I'm still covering everybody pretty well with their sponsorship dollar pertaining to a particular camera. I numbered them all, so I knew which one was which and who sponsored what. So that sort of kept me organised, because I'm not the most diligent person when it comes to administration. But yeah, we ended up raising nearly 10 grand, which was really, really good, because that meant we could go out and buy all these cameras. We imported them, and when you're managing 80 odd cameras, it takes a while to go through them all.
Oh, definitely.
But I mean, we've also got sponsored cameras on the mainland as well. Mark Taylor, the vice president of Tagoa, he's got about nearly a dozen, I think, Tagoa cameras that he's got out in the bush that are sponsored, and he's got about half a dozen of his own. So he's managing about 20 cameras. And in South Australia, we get more sightings from South Australia than we do from Tasmania annually, but they've always been extinct according to the museum, Mm-hmm. But when you start going through the old newspaper articles on the National Newspaper Archive, it's a very different story. They've been seen in South Australia for since 1836, when white people allegedly first arrived. So, who's right, who's wrong?
Yeah, exactly. So this doesn't sound like it's what kind of a plan is this for you? Is this a couple year plan, or is it just going to go as long as money can fund it?
Well, it was a 2-year plan. I came back here in 2019. That 2 years is now up. Mm-hmm. I started in November 2019 when I first started going out bush. I had to get a few things set up the website, get John sorted with some stuff for video content, because John edits all our videos. Mm-hmm. So I'm now into extended time. We've taken camera sponsorship up until, I think, October next year, and I don't really want to take any more sponsorship on, because the cameras aren't that great in quality. And then we got what we could afford we've got our bang for our buck, so to speak. But the weather down here is extremely harsh on electrical equipment outdoors. And these things are out in, minus 10 degrees.
Wow.
And then in summer, it can be 35, even 40. It doesn't get to 40 very often in Tassie, but, 30, 35 isn't out of the question. So there's a lot of, and, then there's extreme weather conditions, but then I get devils and wombats chew the face off the cameras, so.
Yeah.
And then the tree will fall over and crush the camera, or, someone out fossicking looking for gold spots the camera and steals it. I've had about half a dozen stolen just outright. People just think they've got the right to take the shit.
Yeah.
They do. Mm-hmm. So, I have to replace that, and that comes out of the little resource that we have. So this is why I'm not taking on any more sponsors. People want to donate money to help us out. There's capacity for them to do that on our website. But, I don't ask for money. It's just if people want to give, that's great. We had a guy in Victoria who gave us nearly $2,000.
Wow.
And he saw one. And he's an IT guy. He's reasonably wealthy, and he just loves what we do. And he said, mate, get this, get that, buy this, buy that. Here's some money. Go, do it, because he saw one. So he knows they're there.
Yeah.
But, if you ask an expert, they've been extinct on the mainland for a minimum of 2,000 years. But they're seen in every state. So,
Fair enough. So in the next year, do you think thylacine will be classified as de-extinct?
Well, endangered is or critically endangered is where it needs to be. Oddly enough, here's a little bit of conjecture for you. there's a thing online called I think it's called Natural World, Thylacine Museum online. It's official. It's where all the scientists have contributed. It's actually a fantastic resource, but it's very scientific. They even say on there that they consider it to be critically endangered and not extinct due to the validity of so many witness statements.
Wow.
Yet we still don't have the classification changed. So we've got a handful of open-minded scientists that have done their work, and they agree that it's endangered and not extinct, yet for some reason our government still has its head up its arse and can't actually come on board with that statement and throw some resource at, better protection, better research, who knows. But they can raise millions of dollars to try and clone it. Work that out.
It's hard for me to believe that, with all the sightings and everything that's going on, that there's not something going on with the government at play. I don't want to get into it's getting a little conspiracy theorist here, but you know what I'm trying to say, right? Like, there's got to be something.
You only have to see mountains of wood chips going overseas on ships.
That's where I'm getting at.
Really not a conspiracy theorist.
Exactly.
It's about forestries in this state, but so many people in Tassie know it's there, believe it's there. A lot of them don't want it proved because they want to keep it safe, and I get that. But I don't advocate passive-aggressive conservation measures. It's pointless.
Fair enough. Well, Neil, I think that's all I have for you today here, man. This has been great. I friggin' love this. This is a topic that I've wanted to talk about for a long time. I've gotten fascinated with it. I actually heard about it on Joe Rogan's podcast first, which is kind of funny. And then when I saw your documentary on Vice News, I was like, man, I got to talk to that guy. So I really, really appreciate you coming on. I think what you're doing is great. And I really am rooting for you guys, and I'm rooting for not just for you guys, but also obviously for the animal to get the resources that it deserves.
Yeah, mate. It's not about me. It's never been about me. It's about the witnesses, and it's about the animal. That's it. I'm just the conduit to get it there. That's all. And when you asked me before, what happens if we prove it? Well, I'll probably go and write my book, I guess. I don't know. I've started it, but I'm a long way from finishing it, and it probably needs to be rewritten a couple of times once I do. So,
fair enough.
But yeah, honestly, I just throw myself behind this because I had nothing better to do, really, and I just thought it was a good cause, essentially.
Well, I think you're doing great work. I really do.
Yeah, cheers, mate. It's really good. It's good to know that the rest of the world now knows about it. One thing I will claim fame for is the awareness. We raised it. The mission accomplished by far. The scientists, the papers, no one was talking about this thing 7 years ago. Mm-hmm. But I created such a stink, and I'm good at getting the media's attention in my own way, that people are now talking about it. People are interested in it, like yourself, and the whole world knows it's still there.
Well, that's what I'm saying. I mean, we're in Atlantic, Canada here, and I mean, we're gonna get this out to our viewers and our listeners, and you're gonna have even more people who are fascinated in the subject. So keep raising awareness, and we'll get this out. And I'm fascinated by it, and I'm sure a lot more people are gonna be fascinated by it. So thank you for everything you've done. Thank you for coming on today, and we really appreciate that.